This is the largest landowner in Maine, and it is the same one for New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Canada, and the sixth largest in the entire United States. This is the Irving family of New Brunswick, and they own everything. From oil to transportation to shipping to forestry to media to politicians. And you probably don't even know who they are. This is the story of the Irvings, the family that owns the Atlantic. The Irving family starts with James Dergowell Irving, or J.D. Irving, though it becomes what it really is with the son, Kenneth Collin. Casey Irving was a serial entrepreneur. He sold cars in 1923, opened his first gas station in 1924, and by 1930, he had taken over the Ford franchises in the Maritimes. By 1960, the Irving Group had become the massive conglomerate it is today. What makes the Irvings special, and the topic of this video, is their more than controversial growth strategy. Most companies try to grow their shares in their respective markets to capitalize on their core competencies as much as possible. But not the Irvings. The Irving strategy is to be a gigantic fish in a very small pond. And in their pond, they are the kings. Casey Irving would describe the family strategy in these words in a court hearing. I had two choices: expand the core businesses nationally and lose my New Brunswick roots, or diversify within the province. I prefer diversification. Call it conglomerate or what you will. In New Brunswick, it is survival. So, Casey decided to own not only New Brunswick, but the entire Atlantic Canada. This mess is the corporate structure that is the Irving family holdings. This structure is often referred as an example of vertical integration, but in the Maritimes and partially in Maine, this vertical line is pretty much all there is to the economy. There are two main branches of the Irving companies, J.D. Irving Limited and Irving Oil. These two branches eventually grew distant as the patriarch gave control of each branch to separate sons in a very complicated and secretive trust. J.D. Irving Limited branch, owned by J.K. Irving lineage, is the family's forestry, pulp, paper, infrastructure, and shipbuilding side. The company owns massive amounts of lands in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Maine. The family also controls just as much land in land leases by local governments, especially in New Brunswick. This land is used by Cavendish farms and juniper farms to grow food, but more importantly for the family, for forestry. The lumber is cut by Irving Lumber, turned into pulp by Irving Pulp and Paper Mills, and processed in many other ways through the 24 separate Irving subsidiaries throughout. From sapling that's planted by Irving Forest Services to royal toilet paper on the shelves, everything is done by Irving workers. And every input and output of this process is transported by the dozen JDI integrated logistics firms. Maritime shipping handled by Atlantic Towing, its ships produced in Irving shipyards, transcontinental land shipping handled by Midland Transport, New Brunswick Railways for railroad transportation, and all that fueled by Irving Oil and staffed by ProTrans personnel. The second branch is Irving Oil. Irving Oil owns and operates the largest oil and gas refineries in Canada, as well as 1,200 retail locations in the Maritimes and New England. This branch is much more concentrated on the energy side. For a very long time, the family also held a chokehold on local print media. In an age when social media didn't exist, the Irvings controlled the narrative. However, it seems like the family failed to transition their media empire to the internet age. and the media companies were sold to Postmedia Group in 2022. You can easily spot the closed loop of the Irvings. Irving ships import fuel, refineries refine the fuel, sell it retail and to Irving Forestry, which uses the energy to cut down the lumber, which is then transported by Midland trucks to Irving mills, then to retail via Irving tissue. It is a complete control of every cycle in the production chain. But there is really one thing that makes the Irving Company special and as successful as they are. And no, it's not the vertical integration. Many companies have examples of vertical integration. The Irving secret is the concentration of their massive wealth in the poorest regions of Canada and the US. The Irvings own or lease a third of the entire landmass of New Brunswick. 1 in 8 New Brunswickers are employed by Irving companies, and Irving Oil alone represents more than half of all New Brunswick's exports. Almost every New Brunswicker either works for an Irving or has a family member that works for an Irving. It's as far as it gets in the first world to being owned by a feudal family, as none of these companies are public. Every single cent these companies earn using public lands and subsidies goes to a member of the Irving dynasty. And a family that owns every source of wealth, every cent of economic activity in the province, unsurprisingly controls the local government. Perhaps the most outrageous example of this was when Blaine Higgs, a 33-year executive of Irving Oil, became the Premier of New Brunswick and remained in this position from 2018 to 2024. But the story of Irving control over the government goes much further back. From what I could find, the first publicized Irving interference in politics was in 1960, when the Conservative Premier at the time, Hugh John Fleming, refused to give the first option to Irving on the sale of a 95-acre public land. The land was sold to Rothsay Paper Company instead, to Irving's dismay. Casey Irving, angered by this, proceeded to bankroll the Liberal candidate, Louis Robichaud's campaign. Robichaud went on to win the 1960 elections, and his government immediately reneged on the deal promised to Rothsay. The deal was given to Irving instead. However, Robichaud was a great premier by all accounts, and wasn't going to let the Irvings walk all over the government. Robichaud kept Rothsay in the competition with Irving by offering the company a comparable land sale. He then blocked an Irving bid on a mining operation in northern New Brunswick, instead giving it to the Quebecois mining company Noranda to boost up the competition in the province against the Irvings. After 1967 elections, Robichaud's government went after the Irving interests in a way that finally forced Casey Irving to come out in opposition. The 1967 New Brunswick Equal Opportunity Program was aiming to bring a complete reform to the provincial administration. Prior to the Equal Opportunity Program, the municipalities in New Brunswick were responsible for the majority of the public services, from education to healthcare to taxation. This caused a great inequality between richer and poorer municipalities, also causing many legal inconsistencies across the province. With this program, Robichaud's government was centralizing a big portion of these services under the provincial government. But one party was greatly dismayed by this action, and that was Casey Irving. See, prior to this program, Casey could play one municipality against the other for tax cuts and subsidies. The small towns and counties of New Brunswick didn't have much negotiating power against the Irving conglomerate. By 1965, Casey Irving had obtained numerous tax exemptions and favorable contracts with the municipal governments. Now, the much larger provincial government was threatening to disrupt Irving operations with standardized property taxes. In December 1965, as the province announced its planned reforms, Casey Irving appeared before the provincial legislative committee and harshly criticized the reform. No government in its right mind would dare go forward with such a series of measures. We are alarmed that anyone would propose legislation which would deprive industries of their contractual rights. The very next day, Robichaud's Minister of Municipal Affairs, Norbert Theriault, had to clarify in an announcement. The government believes it has a moral obligation to honor these agreements. The Equal Opportunity Program passed, but the Irvings kept their privileges. And from now on, it would only be downhill for the province of New Brunswick. Louis Robichaud would comment years later regarding Casey Irving. I so wanted the industrialization of the province that I did not understand this concept of absolute monopoly was so important to Irving. When he saw that he was losing control, he turned against me. The Irving's next threat would not come from the province, but from Ottawa. The federal government of Pierre Trudeau had initiated the Davie Committee to investigate the media monopolies in Canada, and the Irving media empire was a prime target. The committee found the Irvings as a monopoly, and this was followed by a criminal investigation by the Chief Justice against Irving newspapers. The RCMP raided the company grounds for proof of interference from Casey Irving, but obviously no written proof was found. The charges eventually were dropped. As far as public records go, this would be the last time the Irvings faced government opposition in Canada. The storm was weathered, but Casey had learned a lesson. He wasn't safe in Canada. As any self-styled patriot of New Brunswick would do, he fled to a known tax haven, to Bermuda, while the federal investigation was still ongoing. Casey would spend most of his time in Bermuda from now on, while his sons ran the conglomerate for him. In the coming decade, Casey would completely restructure the conglomerate to guarantee family ownership and tax avoidance, with 3 successive trusts. Just like anything with the Irvings, Casey's trusts and the actual structure established for the company is very secretive. According to leaked documents that became public with the Paradise Papers leak in 2017, all Irving companies were held by holding corporations established in Bermuda by Casey Irving. So now, the Irvings were not only in control of the entire province, but they were running it from Bermuda while paying no taxes. Irving companies seem to have one key competitive advantage compared to their peers: the full government support they receive, which is acquired and expanded through their chokehold on provincial politics. J.D. Irving Limited manages and harvests 2.6 million acres of public land in New Brunswick, completely free of charge, courtesy of a 25-year agreement between the company and the provincial government. According to a 2010 research conducted by CIBC, the province was accused of granting land leases with no obligations provided in return. The report found that the province was in fact losing money on its land deals, some $70 million annually. The findings conclude by describing the status quo as broken and stating that action is needed. Another sector that the Irvings like to flex their power is regulation around forestry. Forestry is a tightly regulated industry, with limited quotas on percentage of trees that could be harvested every year, as well as non-harvestable designated wildlife zones. All of these environmental regulations were limiting the productive capacity of the Irvings. If they could make the government double the harvest quotas, it would be as good as doubling the amount of land the company owned. By late 1990s, J.D. Irving Limited Management decided that loosening the regulations would be their growth strategy in the 2000s. And so, the lobbying began. In 2001, Irving persuaded the progressive conservative government at the time to conduct an independent report to evaluate the viability of loosening forestry regulations in New Brunswick. The consultation was in fact partially financed by J.D. Irving. The final report unsurprisingly recommended doubling the harvest quotas and shrinking the protected wildlife areas. However, the attempt drew too much attention from the public, and Bernard Lord's government at the time stalled the Irvings for the next 5 years. In 2006, Sean Graham's Liberals won the provincial elections. Graham had received the backing of Irving media throughout the election campaign, and now it was his time to pay his dues. Graham's government not only resurfaced the 2001 report, but also added in energy subsidies on top of it. When faced with public backlash again, the Liberal government cited the 5,000 letters sent to the government offices as proof of public support for the legislation. And it was true. Thousands of letters were sent to Fredericton in support. However, there was one problem. The letters were all sent from Irving offices, and they all had the same design and the wording. It would later be revealed that Irving employees had sent these letters as part of a company initiative. The employees were directed to a company website called More Trees Are the Answer, where a letter in their name would be generated and sent with one click. The legislation passed in 2008 amid the financial crisis. The Irvings doubled their harvesting area and received new subsidies. Of course, the provincial government wasn't alone in getting screwed by the Irvings. St. John residents woke up on Tuesday, March 17, 2005 to discover that their city councillors had voted the previous evening to give Irving Oil a staggering tax concession. Canaport LNG's property tax bill would be capped for 25 years at only $500,000, far below the millions Irving would pay otherwise. We have no interest in building an LNG terminal anywhere but here, Kenneth Irving would explain. Irvings loved to mention their love for their hometown, but as usual it carried a costly asterisk. The one outstanding issue was the property tax rate, Kenneth said. We had to make sure the competitive landscape was also attractive. The mayor, Norm McFarlane, had secretly negotiated with Kenneth for months, revealing the deal to councillors as a fait accompli at the very last minute. They had to vote on it that very night, the mayor insisted, because Irving Oil's partner, the Spanish LNG company Repsol, would pull out if there was no approval by midnight. The ultimatum gave the councillors no time to study the details. Yet it passed, 7-4. After the mayor assured them they could trust Kenneth Irving. And this is really funny, I actually had to check this from several sources because I couldn't believe that this actually happened. But that's what McFarlane said to the media. I asked him very clearly and looked into his eyes and said, "Kenneth, you look into my eyes and tell me, if this doesn't happen, will this facility not be here?" And he very clearly said, "Yes, that is true." A very touching leap of faith by Mayor McFarlane, though it would be a costly one for the taxpayers. City Council voted on Monday to approve the deal that would see Irving Oil pay only $500,000 annually in property taxes for Canaport. Later revealed financial statements of Irving Oil showed that the company at the time was making $150 million in profits, while begging for tax cuts. The concession also went against Robbie Shaw's municipal reforms that we mentioned earlier, so New Brunswick government would have to amend its statutes to legalize Mayor McFarlane's deal with Kenneth Irving. But few were surprised. Governments had been helping the Irvings at public expense for years, and this latest example, while particularly egregious, was nothing new. This move was evidently even too egregious for the JDI Limited side of the family, as the media owned by JDI Limited ripped into the LNG deal as well, though this was less likely due to the goodness of their hearts and more about the ongoing succession crisis between the different branches of the family, but we will get to that later. The tax deal was repealed after a decade of public backlash, finally in 2016. The city is estimated to have lost $180 million, a massive amount for a smaller city like St. John. Not even the other Canadian oligarchs could hope to compete with the Irvings in their home turf. McCain family is a fellow New Brunswicker billionaire heavy hitter conglomerate. McCain Foods is one of the largest frozen food companies globally, and the family is comparable to the Irvings in wealth. However, where the Irvings went local, McCain's went global and national, so they commanded way less power in their home province of New Brunswick. The two conglomerates were partners until the 1980s. However, the relations quickly soured when McCain Foods fired Irving Oil as its fuel supplier, and in 1980 J.D. Irving Limited bought Prince Edward Island-based potato company C.M. McLean Potato, which was later branded as Cavendish Farms. Irving was now becoming a chief competitor to McCain's in frozen potato products. In 1989, the two companies got into a bidding war over a government-subsidized potato plant on the island. Eventually, the provincial government of PEI had to extend the same deal to both companies. The very next year, another government-subsidized Irving potato plant project in New Brunswick could only be stopped after the McCains lobbied the American government to threaten with punitive tariffs. The Irvings didn't have the same pull in Washington, D.C. as the McCains, and cheap Canadian products flooding the American markets was always a sensitive topic south of the border. The Irving plans were rolled back. The McCain-Irving feud culminated in the 1998 Nova Scotia natural gas bidding war. The bid was for the construction and operating rights for the Maritime and Northeast Pipeline that would transport the Nova Scotian LNG. Irving Oil saw this as a golden opportunity to not only consolidate its control over energy, but also to grow its influence in Maine. However, there was one problem. Harrison McCain had decided that the feud wasn't over yet. He partnered up with Alberta-based energy giant Enbridge Gas and bid on the project. J.D. Irving's side of the family supported Irving Oil. However, the McCain-Enbridge partnership was too big for even both of the Irvings. But this was New Brunswick. It wasn't an even playing field. It was the Irving Fortress. The government of New Brunswick, to everyone's surprise, announced that the local industries above a certain size would gain an exemption and have direct access to the pipeline at discounted prices, bypassing the bid owner. The Irvings were pretty much the only companies qualified for this exemption. Irving Oil was disqualified from the bid after refusing to disclose financial statements. Thus, McCain and Enbridge won and built the pipeline, though the project proved largely unprofitable for them, thanks to the direct access given to the Irvings. Though Enbridge is planning to expand the pipeline, so maybe it wasn't as unprofitable as they previously claimed. Who knows? Either way, it didn't matter if it was a $150 billion gas and oil giant. Nobody competed with the Irvings in New Brunswick. Harrison McCain publicly accused the Irvings of being a monopoly after this bid. Ironically, as McCain Foods itself is a national oligopoly. The two corporate giants seem to have made peace since then, as they are now fighting a class action court battle in the US for allegedly forming a potato cartel. In December 2015, it was revealed that the Chief Medical Officer of Health of New Brunswick, Dr. Eilish Clary, was abruptly placed on leave and later terminated from her position by the provincial government. Shortly before her termination, the herbicide glyphosate had been labeled as probably carcinogenic to humans by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Around this time, Dr. Clary was studying the herbicide. It was speculated that J.D. Irving was behind Dr. Clary's firing. J.D. Irving would dismiss the speculations as conspiracy theories. From union suppression, to exploiting oil tankers, to tax exemptions, to unfair subsidies, to owning 4 times as much land in Prince Edward Island than the legal limits, it seems that Irvings ruled the Canadian Maritimes. However, the family also has a firm grasp on politics south of the border. By late 70s, a US government survey found Maine had the most foreign-owned land at 17% of any state, and the Irvings owned most of it. In 1992, when Casey died, Irving Oil had 25% of the state's gas business and 60% of its industrial fuel market. And Maine provided the Irving Empire with an ideal jumping-off point for expansion further south. As put by Arthur Irving, the Maritimes are closer to New York and Boston than to Toronto. The richest market in the world is in the northeastern seaboard of the United States. That is the natural way for us to go. And Maine seems to be the target of the family since then. Just like New Brunswick, Maine has a small economy with a strong forestry industry, in which the Irvings could once again be the big fish in a small pond. The state is also in proximity to Irving base of operations in the Maritimes, which makes the expansion logistically easier. Though the Irvings found a much more hostile environment in Maine than in the Maritimes, in New Brunswick, they were seen in a sympathetic light by the locals. Meanwhile in Maine, they were foreign invaders of sorts. In some towns, Irving Oil would buy up several gas stations to squeeze out established retailers. Urged on by citizens, state legislators sought legal means to block them, or at least slow them down. In the forested northern reaches of the state, meanwhile, there was anger over clear cutting by Irving Woodlands. The company was accused of violating federal health and safety rules and timber harvesting standards. Some towns passed local ordinances to block tree plantations. At some point, the Irvings even had the Premier McCain of New Brunswick call the state legislators in Maine to strike down bills against them. The family's fortunes in state politics changed in 1996, when the governor of Maine, Angus King, vetoed an environmental bill regarding forestry regulations. In 2012, the state granted the Irvings extended logging rights under the name of outcome-based forestry in a secret contract, which was leaked only in 2013. And in 2021, Governor Janet Jackson vetoed a herbicide bill targeted at Irving operations. As of 2025, Irving seems to be on track to consolidate their control in Maine. Their track record proved that sooner or later, they get what they want. Politicians come and go, and the Irvings, sooner or later, find their opening. There's something about the Irvings that makes this something beyond your classic monopolistic anti-corporate story, and I think that is their dependence on Canadian taxpayer money. None of the Irving businesses do anything revolutionary. They aren't Google or Facebook. With or without the Irvings, someone would be cutting those forests and someone would be refining the fuel. What sets them apart from competition is that they get to control the resources of an entire province. They set the government policies, they get to harvest public land for free, and they get to write the tax code. They are almost treated like a state-owned agency with the amount of government support they receive. And there is a reason for that. This makes the Irving businesses competitive, not just in Canada, but in the US. From the perspective of New Brunswick, Perhaps there is an argument to be made in favor of the Irvings. Forestry and oil are sectors where you need scale to be competitive. In a small province like New Brunswick, perhaps you do need the government to ensure that the local businesses are scaled competitively with state subsidies. Where it all falls apart, of course, is that the Irvings take all the subsidies and taxpayer money, then hide their profits in Bermuda to avoid paying taxes. Irvings, at the end of the day, use public resources to extract raw materials out of public land and then do everything in their power to avoid the taxes that they are supposed to pay. However, behind all the corporate layers, the Irving story is a story of a dynasty, not a company. It's not set in a soulless boardroom with faceless shareholders and bank executives. It is HBO Succession. And as of 2025, the bells may be ringing for the Irving dynasty. Upon Patriarch Casey's death in 1992, the Irving empire was split into three groups. Eldest son J.K. Irving got J.D. Irving Limited, Arthur got Irving Oil, and Jack Irving got Ocean Capital. We see the cracks in the empire form in the 90s. In truth, J.D. Irving Limited and Irving Oil had key conflicting interests. J.D. Irving needed low energy prices to remain profitable. Meanwhile, Irving Oil profited from high fuel prices, which led them to lobby for opposing policies. It also seems like the Irving brothers had no love lost between them, though what we know unfortunately is mostly just speculation. What we know, however, is the fate of Kenneth Irving and the consequent interfamily legal battle. Kenneth Irving was the eldest son of Arthur Irving and heir apparent to Irving Oil. He was the CEO of Irving Oil in late 2000s, and sources note that the company was still controlled by Kenneth's father even when he was the CEO. After the 2008 economic crisis, the stress became too much for Kenneth, and he started engaging in self-harm. The same year, he was admitted into a mental institution for this reason. What happened after that, however, was extremely weird. Arthur Irving visited his son in the hospital, and that would be the last time they would ever speak. After this, every trace of Kenneth was removed from Irving Oil. If you check Arthur Irving's Wikipedia page today, you won't see any mentions of Kenneth, only his sister Sarah, who replaced him as the heir apparent. It was like Kenneth, the failure son, had never existed. In 2008, the same year, it was leaked that the Irvings were splitting the empire up, officially. Until then, although the Irving empire was partitioned, it was still part of one single conglomerate. And now, Irving Oil and J.D. Irving Limited were officially splitting up into separate companies. As usual, we don't know much, but it turned into one of the costliest legal battles as far as we know, as the Irvings fought each other and against their father Casey's trusts in a Bermuda court. The case dragged on for years and is estimated to have cost $100 million. During the same Bermuda Trust invalidation case, Kenneth demanded a retirement party in Irving Oil grounds, recognition for his work as the former CEO, a face-to-face meeting with his siblings and his father. None of these demands were given. The Irving conglomerate survived the 2008 succession by getting partitioned between the sons. Now, the dynasty faces yet another succession. Arthur Irving died in May 2024, followed by his brother J.K. in June. And this comes after Irving Oil announced plans of a strategic review that would contemplate full or partial sale. It is speculated that the company is looking to get out of the allegedly shrinking refinery business, but I suspect the reason is to get liquidity for succession. It is also equally suspicious that Sarah Irving, the heir apparent, was pushed out of the leadership race after Arthur's death, and the company then proceeded to have a leadership shakeup. Who knows, maybe the company was fully or partially sold privately. As with everything concerning the Irvings, there is nothing we know for sure, and only the time will tell what will happen to the Lords of the Maritimes.